You were a lifelong entrepreneur. You did everything from fireworks to banking, gambling, real estate, hotels, restaurants, etc. When you got involved with entrepreneurship, the first business you were involved with was selling fireworks.
I remember in the 70s when I was a child, graffiti was a big thing around the world, but you never saw that in a small town because you knew the people's wall that someone would write on.
Sean, thank you for being on the show.
Oh, Raj, I'm so excited to be on your show. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to see what all the things you have going. What a great company you have. And I'd like to interview you, actually.
Maybe we can do that next time.
I'll take you up on that.
I do appreciate your time today. So you are an entrepreneur, author, felon, speaker. Your book, The Great Choice, is an excellent read. I read it in 2 days because I was truly captivated by the way you put together your life story. And your story is one worth telling. I think it's extremely interesting. You've seen the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. You were a lifelong entrepreneur. You did everything from fireworks to banking, and in between some gambling, real estate, hotels, restaurants, etc. You were the co-founder, CEO of Allegiant Bank Corp. At one point, one of the largest publicly traded bank holding companies. You grew that bank from a little bank in Northeast Missouri to one that had over 2 billion in holdings and eventually sold it for 500 million. So an incredible story. Before we get to that, I'd really like to learn a little more about how you grew up. You grew up in Thayer, Missouri, a town of less than 2,000. What was that like for you? How did that kind of shape who you eventually became?
You know, I tell people, one, the Midwest is a great place to grow up, but to grow up in a town of a couple thousand people is such an experience because you know everyone or you know someone who knows someone. And I remember in the 70s when I was a child, graffiti was a big thing around the world, but you never saw that in a small town because you knew the people's wall that someone would write on. So it gave you a sense of community, a sense of place. I don't watch TV, but I know there was a show. And in a small town, in the fall, it's football on Friday nights. In the winter, it's basketball. And in the spring and the summer, it's baseball. It's a real sense of community. So it was a wonderful, I wouldn't trade where I grew up for anything. The problem is, and I talked to a lot of people that I grew up with and other people I've met through my journey in life who grew up in small towns, it's just hard to make a really good living because there's just not the economic opportunity.
When you say really good living, I did read in your book that you were really driven to become a millionaire. And just for context for some of the viewers or listeners, back then, that would have been maybe 10 times what being a millionaire is today. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I have one cousin on my mother's side, and his grandfather and my grandfather were brothers, and his grandfather died, and he had $300,000. And of course, I Googled that'd be $1.9 million. And in a town of 2,000 people, you have brothers that each have $300,000 a lifetime ago. So you have to put perspective. So yeah, $1 million isn't what it was. There's a lot more millionaires than there were in those days.
When you got involved with entrepreneurship, the first business you were involved with was selling fireworks, correct?
Yeah, the people don't realize this, but in a small town, there's nothing. And our science teacher, who actually quit teaching after my sophomore year, bought a satellite company, ended up becoming a multimillionaire in the cell phone tower business. But he showed us and I've never told anyone this, 4 films that were about an hour long that year. And William Shatner, who was starving to death at that time in life, described what an entrepreneur was. I'd never heard that word. I went all the way through undergraduate business school. Entrepreneurship was not mentioned. To me, entrepreneurship is a child of the late 80s till today, and I love it. And that's really what makes this country great is you can come here and start with little, and if you work hard and you can do very well. You're an example of that. That's why I say sometime I am going to interview you. But yeah, I was looking for a job in the summer of 80, and my dad said, "What are you going to do?" I was working at my cousin that I spoke of earlier, his wife's gift store. And he said, "One, you're not making any money." I said, "Two, but I'm meeting a lot of cute gals." And he said, "That isn't going to cut it." And so literally, Raj, to make a long story short, I talked a fireworks company in Little Rock, Arkansas, into giving me $20,000 worth of fireworks on consignment. I worked 3 weeks, had a great suntan, read a lot of books, and made $20,000. And in 1980, that would be like 100,000. And for a college kid, that was a start. And so it's the most wonderful thing in the world that you can have an idea and watch it come to fruition.
Yeah, I equally share that kind of passion for entrepreneurship, and that's partly why, or the main reason why I'm in this country. I think if you want to reach your potential as an entrepreneur, you need to be in the U.S. That's my opinion, at least. I find it interesting that as someone who, from such an early age, was so, I guess, interested in or just taken over by entrepreneurship, you decided to go into one of the more conservative professions, which is banking. How did you end up with your first banking gig, and why did you decide to go into banking?
Oh, and that's interesting you say that because my parents, who gave me little guidance, they were both a greatest generation, World War II, and they said, basically, you do anything you want to do, but don't be a banker. I had a college professor who was he was crazy. He was like in Back to the Future, the professor guy. His hair kind of stuck up, and I had him in Economics 1, and then as a senior, I had him in Money and Banking 2. And you had 3 preferential interviews, and he said, you should interview with the bank. And I said, why? And he goes, the world is changing. And that 40 years ago was the beginning of the evolution. It's also the beginning of the decline, the end of banking. And I talk about that early in the book, how now it's going to Chick-fil-A or McDonald's, and it's a whole different thing. But I got in at the right time, and my dad had a partner who was unbelievably successful. And he actually had 2. The other one, there's a funny Sam Walton story that sometime we're not on the air, I'll tell you about people who come to me with business plans and choosing not to go on board. And he had a chance to be with Sam Walton. But the other one said, Sean, he goes, you're going to learn, if nothing else, how to borrow money. And that was half of it. The other half of it was I came to St. Louis, which you came here as an outsider. And most people say it's a very tough town. And it's very parochial. It's a wonderful thing. It has a small town feel to it. There's a lot of great things, but it's harder on locals than it is on those of us who come from the outside because they can't put us in a box. And so I came here, and I literally have been thrown out of every door in St. Louis, I jokingly say. But I knew Chuck Knight, August Bush III at one end. At the other end, the second bank I bought was at Grand in West Florissant, which when I went there was the highest crime rate census tract in the city of St. Louis. So I've had the privilege, and I call it a privilege, of meeting people from both ends of the spectrum. And I grew up where race didn't matter, age didn't matter, because when you're a small town, everyone's equal. You don't understand what money is because there's not a huge discrepancy like you can see in a metropolitan area. You didn't have TV in those days that glorified so many things that I think can make it hard for people to get beyond. And so I came here, and I was just a guy from Thayer, and they couldn't say, oh, you're from that parish, or oh, you went to that school, because they're very quickly to say, oh, then they make a social judgment. With someone from out of town, they can't. And that's what made my career successful.
That's a great point. I also think that outsiders kind of see St. Louis for what it can be versus what it was. I find that sometimes, not always, locals are a little more pessimistic about the region than outsiders. I think it's one of America's uncovered gems that just has a ton of potential. Would you agree that St. Louis today is still, number one, a great place to be, and then also just has a ton of potential to be like a Nashville, Austin?
Absolutely. But the strange part, you just said something unique. My sister and her husband went to Nashville 55 years ago, and he told me, not knowing I was going to be in St. Louis because I was in school, in high school, he said, Nashville will pass St. Louis. And now we have to have that idea, that attitude, we'll pass Nashville. And I agree. Outsiders see what it can be. And it's a wonderful place. The other thing is, there's 160 million people not that far away. And I dealt a lot in New York, and I always had family, and I still have 2 sons in LA, and we're flyover. You know, we're west of the Appalachians and east of the Rockies to most people, but this is really where it is. And especially when you look at bio, there's agri and bio opportunities and things. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunity here, and it'll do well in the future because of all the things that made it what it should have been. But some people, as always, leaders can make some foolish decisions and choose not to lead. And this area lost a lot of time for that.
that potential that the city has had for so long and hasn't really capitalized on, is that the same kind of potential that you saw when you first came to St. Louis?
I did. I spent almost 2 years in Kansas City. And as I say, the arch belongs in Kansas City because it's really the gateway to the West. St. Louisans used to think they were Easterners and they're not even the right time zone. But, it had all those things. And, the economy is very diverse. It has, you have healthcare. We have a great financial community here. People don't realize that. Other than New York, we're like number two in financial firms. You have manufacturing, you have government, and it has one of those things that gives it that. The other thing is, my wife was with, at the time, the largest law firm in the state of Missouri. I don't know anymore, but they did work all over the world because you could pay a lawyer here $250 an hour and get the same quality work you could get in New York City for $850 or in London for $750. And businesses see that. We all know now businesses, I learned this almost 40 years ago. Business is 724. It's global. And smart people say, where can I outsource resource and run my company more efficiently? And that's the thing we offer here.